Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Just Law on IQRA TV. Just before the break, we had a query in relation to entrepreneur applications and in particular how to make a successful settlement application. And just before that, we had a caller who had called in and inquiring about spouse applications, and in particular we were going to look at how the financial requirement can be met. And I asked the caller in terms of his position, whether he was working or self-employed. The caller explained that he was employed and he'd been employed by the same company for 6 months or so. So it just so happens that we are moving on to that subject anyway. We've looked at what an applicant needs from their home country in terms of the TB certificate, the English certificate, and we've looked at a copy of the sponsor's passport in the UK that will be submitted to show that the person's status in the UK, etc. Now let's look at the area which causes a significant amount of problems, which is the financial requirement which needs to be met. As I said at the outset, under the old rules, a sponsor earning £5,000 would have been sufficient, but under the new rules there has to be a minimum income being received of £18,600. There are some exceptions to that, and we'll try and deal with that later on, but on the whole it has to be that requirement which needs to be fulfilled. The easiest case in terms of sponsorship is where somebody has been employed for 6 months, and in that situation the requirement in terms of documents is relatively easy in terms of wage slips, bank statements and the employment letter. But let's just look at each of them in turn to make sure that for each of them they are in the correct format and they meet the specific requirements relating to each of those documents. Now an easy example to look at or to begin with is the 6 months wage slips. Now if you're getting paid monthly, obviously that will be 6 months full of wage slips. If you're getting paid weekly, it will be 26 weeks of wage slips. Contrast that with a situation where somebody gets paid 4 weekly. In that case, 6 4-weekly wage slips will only cover 24 weeks and not 26 weeks. So 7 of those wage slips will need to be submitted to cover the whole 6-month period. Now that in itself isn't a problem. You need to make sure that as far as the wage slips are concerned, there is sufficient income there. Now, even as far as income is concerned, the Home Office draws a distinction between salaried employment and non-salaried employment. So this complication in terms of meeting the requirements, it's a complication which exists with each of the different documents that need to be submitted. So in terms of employment, they will look at whether you're employed on a salaried employment or whether it's non-salaried employment. If it's salaried employment, it's where the salary is fixed. So for example, where somebody works in an office and has a salary of, let's say, £20,000 a year, that's fixed irrespective of the hours that they work, and they classify that as salaried employment. But with that, you just need to make sure that that level of income that you are claiming, for example, if you're on £20,000 a year, that level of income is received for the duration of the 6 months that you are relying on. Now, let's say somebody during the 6 months decides to take unpaid leave, which happens regularly, where somebody's got married abroad, they've decided halfway through, after they've got 3-4 months wage slips, to go abroad and go for an extended period. Let's say get 2 weeks of paid leave, 2 weeks of unpaid leave. So when they come back and they get their wage slips for that month where they've been on holiday, the wage drops below what the minimum required amount is on a monthly basis. That can potentially cause a problem as well, because as far as salaried employment is concerned, the Home Office will take into account the lowest salary that a person's received during the 6 months before the application is submitted. Contrast that with non-salaried employment, and typically you tend to find this where someone works in a factory where their weekly pay, monthly pay, whatever it is actually based on the hours that they've worked. Now for that it's slightly easier in the sense that the Home Office will take the average amount earned over the 6-month period. Now, that does make things easier. The reason for that is that if there is a month where the income has dropped, if you look at the former example where somebody's gone abroad and taken unpaid leave, that causes less of a problem for somebody who is on non-salaried employment. Their income for that month will drop, but because their income is looked at over 6 months and the real average is worked out, they can make up for the shortfall in wages in the middle of the month by working extra hours later on, or if they've had a busy few months before they've been on holiday. So you can take the average into account, and as long as within the 6 months you earn £9,300, that's sufficient to meet the income requirement. So even something simple as 6 months wage slips, there are complications in terms of which category it falls into. Now, moving on to let's say the bank statements which have to be submitted, and again this deals with what the caller called about just before the break. It's 6 months bank statements. There you need to be careful that the bank statements that you submit are not more than 28 days old when you submit the application, and also that the documents, the bank statements, cover the whole 6 months. So you don't submit bank statements which cover 5.5 months. Make sure they cover 6 months, and they cover the same period as your wage slips. So for example, if you are relying on wage slips for October, November, December, January, February, March, you need to make sure that your bank statements start from the 1st of October onwards to the end of March. So they cover the same period as the wage slips. So you need to make sure they're not too old when they're submitted. They need to be up to date, and they need to cover the same period as well. The other thing that you need to make sure is that you're submitting either original bank statements, or you're submitting bank statements which have been stamped by the bank confirming that they are original as well. So even something as simple as bank statements can cause problems in terms of not meeting the specific requirements that the Home Office requests. Another problem sometimes that you face is that the bank account that the individual has is in joint names. It may be that historically they've had a joint bank account and they've continued to use that. That will only be acceptable if the bank statement is in the joint name with the husband or wife. If it's in joint names with somebody else, such as a parent or a brother, a sister, etc., that won't be acceptable, because the Home Office won't be satisfied that the money that's going in is the sponsor's money, because that bank statement has somebody else's name on it. So it has to be really, from a practical point of view, a statement which is in the name simply of the sponsor in the United Kingdom. So you've got to make sure it's up to date. You've got to make sure it covers the period of the bank, the wage slips. You have to make sure that it's original or stamped by the bank. So there are a number of requirements, even with bank statements, which need to be satisfied. The third requirement, again this applies to the caller who called earlier, in relation to finances, is that as a minimum an employment letter has to be submitted. Now, the employment letter doesn't necessarily have to be on a proper letter-headed paper. As long as there is a letter from the employer confirming a number of different things, it's sufficient. So what does the employment letter need to confirm? That obviously it has to confirm that the sponsor is working for the employer. The letter has to confirm when the sponsor commenced employment. The letter has to confirm what the employee sponsor is receiving in the United Kingdom, and the letter has to confirm for how long that the sponsor, the employee, has been receiving that sum of money, and also finally what kind of job that post is, whether it's permanent, temporary, fixed term, 0 hours contract, etc. So there are a number of things that the employment letter needs to consider. If there are certain things which are missing, the Home Office may decide not to reject the application, but there is always a risk that if the minimum information that the Home Office requires on a letter is not there, the Home Office could always take the view that the mandatory minimum information isn't there, and therefore they are going to reject the application. Just a couple of other matters on the letter before we move on. Again, make sure that the letter is dated within 28 days of the date of the application, so it's not too old. Secondly, you have to make sure that the employment letter is done, is signed off by somebody relatively senior, so it has to normally be a manager, etc. Or alternatively, what you find in bigger companies is that it is somebody within the HR department who will sign off the letter. So that's typically the documents that you submit on a very straightforward spouse application. Now, it gets more complicated when there are, and this is something that you increasingly see, two jobs being relied upon in order to meet the minimum income requirement. It may be that there's a first job where a person is earning, let's say, £13,000–14,000 a year, and then because there's a shortfall of £5,000 to £6,000, there's a second part-time job which is also relied upon. Now, if that's the case, basically two jobs are being relied upon, then the requirement in terms of documents, obviously that requirement has to be met for both sets of employment, for both jobs. So it's not sufficient that one is perfect and the other isn't. Both jobs need to be have existed for 6 months in most cases, and the requirements have to be fulfilled for that as well. Now, just on that point, we get a number of cases where two jobs have been relied upon. Now, in my experience, where the sponsor is doing two jobs, you will tend to find that the Home Office, once they receive the application and they go through it, you will tend to find that they will make a phone call to both the sponsor and the employers as well to find out certain things about the job. Now, the reason for the phone call is really for the Home Office to try and find out whether the job is genuine or not. If the sponsor receives a call, sponsor should try and ensure that the call, that they do take the call. In my experience, the Home Office tends to call 3 or 4 times during the day, sometimes before 9 o'clock if they can't catch the sponsor. But if they're unable to speak to the sponsor, then they may, in some cases, say, look, we've been unable to verify the employment, and they may reject the application. So it is important that the sponsor does take that call. They do tend to call on an unknown number, and obviously a lot of people have this practice of not taking calls which come from unknown numbers. A lot of them are nuisance calls, etc. But with this, you do have to look out for the call from the Home Office. If a standard application is submitted, you can sort of work out when the Home Office will call. Tends to be around the 2-month mark after the documents have been submitted to the Home Office. That's when they tend to make the call to the sponsor and the employer. Where the application that's been submitted is a priority application, then they tend to make the call much earlier, generally around the 4th or the 5th week. So it gives you an idea as to when the application is likely to be looked at, and it gives you an idea when a caseworker from the Home Office is likely to make a phone call. It's important that the call is taken and the questions are answered. Now, what are the questions which are asked by the Home Office when the Home Office do call? Now, the idea behind it is to establish whether the job is genuine or not. So one would expect that certain basic information will be requested, such as who the employer is, what their telephone number is, what their address is, what their email address is, etc. So certain basic information. Then they tend to ask about the physical characteristics of where the employment is undertaken. So it may be information about the building in which the employee works, so such as, describe the locality in which the building is, what's to your right, what's to your left, what's the main road sort of outside where the office or factory is. It may be well, let's take a call before we carry on with this. Hello.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam, Jibai. Thank you for calling. What's your question?
But this call is not regarding marriages, it's regarding IPP sentence.
All right, okay.
Okay, well, I've been out now for more than 2 years, but
Okay.
I just want to know if I can appeal to take off my IPP.
All right, okay. So what was the sentence for?
The sentence I got done before was dangerous driving and a few other bits and stuff.
All right, okay.
But I just want to appeal against my IPP.
All right, okay. All right, okay. Thank you very much for your call. Let me deal with that. See, normally, what happens with any kind of sentence is that there is a period within which the appeal needs to be submitted, and it's normally a short period of time. And I think what the caller mentioned is that this is something that took place more than 2 years ago. So the problem is, in terms of appealing against the actual conviction, the likelihood is that is well out of time. Now, with a lot of convictions, there comes a time when that is no longer on your record. It's something which is known as the rehabilitation of offenders. It's an act which deals with when certain convictions become spent. So with motoring matters, normally these matters become spent roughly after 3 to 4 years, and in terms of any points that you've received, that normally comes off your license after 4 years, but no longer taken into account after 3 years in any event. But in terms of appealing against certain convictions, these are matters where the period within which that needs to be done is a relatively short period. Now, unfortunately, if it's 2 years down the line, it may well be that that period has been missed. Now, just going back to what we were discussing before, which is the kind of questions that will be asked. So they could ask about general questions about contact numbers, telephone numbers, etc. You could ask about the business in terms of where the location is, where the nearest car park is. If you have a lunch hour, where do you go for lunch in terms of where any sandwich shops are close by. So they could ask about the physical location of the place where you work. Internally, they could ask about, for example, how many floors that building has where you work. You may be asked to describe the office within which you work, what that looks like, how many desks there are, how many people work there, etc. You may be asked about how you actually go to work in terms of describing your journey, how long it takes, how many miles it is. If you take the bus, they may ask you in terms of which bus you take, etc. Now, all these questions are asked in order to probe and find out whether the business, whether the employment is genuine or not. They would then move on to the actual employment, and in my experience, where a lot of people run into difficulties is in describing how they actually got the job. Was it through an advert? Was it through a recommendation? Did they submit a CV? Did they email the employer? Was there an interview? You'll be asked about all this information in terms of how you actually got the job. Now, if it's a job which is well paid, they may ask about why is it that you were selected for the post, in terms of what experience did you have as to why you were selected, especially if they feel that you're quite young, you're doing a job which is extremely well paid. They may ask why you've been given that job over others. Now, so that's about the job. In terms of the actual duties that you do, again, that's a tricky question for people, because what the Home Office wants is for you to be very specific and list your actual job duties. And when somebody's phoned by the Home Office out of the blue and they're asked to describe what they do, sometimes people talk in very, very general terms. They say, we do this, that and the other. And the Home Office then says, well, you weren't able to give specifics about your employment. You only gave very general descriptions in terms of what you do, and that may be something which is used against you. You may be asked about your colleagues in terms of who the managers are, who you report to, how many people work there, who your immediate colleagues are that you work with on a daily basis, how old they are, etc. Whether you work with them or whether they are based elsewhere within the business. So you could be asked specific questions about your colleagues. Now, moving on to your income, again, obviously there's a minimum income requirement. So they want to be sure that you're on the salary that you claim to be on. So they could ask you about your salary, how long you've been on the salary, whether you get monthly wage slips, weekly wage slips, how you get the wage slips. You could be asked about your gross pay, what the deductions are, what your net pay is. So these are a whole host of questions that they can ask you. They may ask you more general questions about the business in terms of turnover, in terms of whether it is a business which is VAT registered or not, etc. So you need to be prepared for all that. Now, you may well be prepared, but like I said at the outset, they are likely to not only call you, they are likely to call your employer as well. And all these questions that we've run through, they are likely to ask your employer the same questions as well. Specifically about how you got the job, what your duties are, how much you get paid, etc. So it's important that in terms of what you say, in terms of what the employer says, obviously it'll be genuine, but there is consistency in what is said. We'll look at the other aspects of the spouse application in next week's show. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so we'll be back on Monday next week at 6 o'clock. Until then, Assalamu alaikum.